Hi, it is Friday. It's so Friday. Benedict has been waiting very impatiently for a snack. Today's snack is little bits of rice cake. Isn't that right, Ben? A little bit of oh, he's standing like a groundhog. He doesn't know what to think of it. Oh, there's the crunch. Hi, Sharkies. Hi, Farmos. Hello. How are you? Sushi for dinner. Oh, we are going to have some pad thai after the stream is done. From Green Basil, which we haven't had from there for a while, so I hope it's good. So, crisis averted. It turns out that Farmhouse has been able to arrange all of her classes to be on Thursdays, so we don't have to worry about Wednesdays at all anymore. We can keep the schedule as is without changing things up. So that's good. And also, it sounds like the classes on Thursdays were just better in general, anyways. So, it's win win win. Oh, all right. Here, you have to guess which hand it's in, though. Did you see that dance? That was such a cute dance. Which hand's it in? Which hand? Oh, he went straight to it. Oh, that's the one. Yeah, he got it. He must have seen it going there. Or he's just super clever. Whatever. He's clever anyway. But he went straight to the right hand. Rice cake! So, yeah. That's good. That's all I got. That's all I got. Except for all the rest that's in the bowl. That's all I got in my hands, though. Oh, oh. He was kind of bullying me for a snack before I had the camera on, which I did not concede to, but he did go over and push the dino with his nose, went bonk, and the dino rocked back and forth. So, I think I'm not gonna delay too much today. Vandalism, right? I did not cave into the threats. Threats of violence are not to be tolerated. He's watching me. I think he maybe likes the rice cakes. So we had an interesting chapter. Chapter 9 was quite a bit went on. So they were traveling with King Chohag through Sandaria. After they came out of the cave, they were a bit lost, but Dernick eventually got directions. It turns out they were going entirely the wrong direction. And so Aunt Pole decided that she and Garion and Princess Anedra needed to do a little stop by Faldor's farm on their way to the palace of Sendar in Sendar. Which was interesting. That whole scene was pretty interesting. Definitely had I think Garion realized during that he didn't really fit in there anymore. and he officially parted ways with his childhood, I think, and his childhood companions as well. Dorune wasn't even there at all, had moved away, and yeah, so he had a talk with Runderig and didn't really have a talk with Zubret. Showed Sinedra around the place, so she got a look at where he grew up. And Aunt Pole visited the kitchen there one last time. After that, they headed for the palace, King Fulrak's palace, where Belgrath was in a foul mood. But Greldick sailed in and said they'd be able to depart in the morning. And Queen Layla had a bit of a fit. I don't know if anybody remembered in Pawn of Prophecy that she was terrified of sea travel, but she remains terrified of sea travel and was told that she was going to have to come with them. And that's more or less where we left off. So we're on chapter 10. In my copy, it's page 89. We also discovered that my copy is edited. So frustrating. So there may be some changes between mine and the Sharky's copy, so let me know if you notice anything else, please. These travels sure have a different feeling knowing that Brill isn't just going to show up out of nowhere. Yeah, I guess so. Also, this part of the journey, pretty much once they escaped, like, Murgoland, I don't know, has felt fairly abridged. I feel like the actual travel part of it has felt more sort of glossed over than it had before. They spent some time in Algaria, but the actual traveling, like from Algaria to Prolgu, was skipped entirely. And then the travel from Prolgu to Sendaria was heavily skipped over. Not entirely, but it was pretty abridged. And then the journeys through Sendaria were also pretty, like, we got told about how, like, we read about Faldor's farm, but the actual travel across Sendaria was pretty glossed over as well. I guess, you know, they've been through all of these areas before, and nothing too interesting is taking place. Excuse me, I got a little water. Nothing too interesting is taking place during the actual travel parts, I guess, but yeah, we're not seeing very much of the actual traveling. I guess part of it's probably also that it's becoming a little routine to Garion, and that's probably why it doesn't feel as new to him, so it doesn't stand out as much. Alright. So I'm going to get into chapter 10. Everybody ready? Let me take a quick refresher on the bingo sheet, which has this huge red blotch, but to be fair, you know, the spot was for Faldor's farm being mentioned or other nostalgia, and it definitely got heavily mentioned, so that's why that's so overdone. So we're still waiting on Garion doing something unexpected, Silk being very sarcastic, Pyrodernic, Mandaralan being Mandaralan. We haven't seen very much of him recently. Belgrath being itchy, Garion eavesdropping, Taiba especially going after Relg, noisy magic, snobby magic, kidnappings, Garion getting cocky, Silk being a rogue, divinity, head injuries, uncomfortable situations, manners, manners. Don't touch me, which could happen at the same time as this one. Those could be a twofer. And Barak being Barak. Alright. They were 2 days at sea from Sendar to Riva, running before a quartering wind with their patched sail booming and the driving spray that froze to everything it touched. The cabin below decks was crowded, and Garion spent most of his time topside, trying to stay out of the wind and out from under the sailors' feet at the same time. Inevitably, he moved finally to the sheltered spot in the prow, sat with his back against the bulwark and his blue hooded cloak tight about him, and gave himself over to some serious thinking. The ship rocked and pitched in the heavy swells, and frequently slammed head-on into monstrous black waves, shooting spray in all directions. The sea around them was flecked with whitecaps, and the sky was a threatening, dirty gray. Garion's thoughts were almost as gloomy as the weather. His life, for the past 15 months, had been so caught up in the pursuit of the orb that he had not had time to look toward the future. Now the quest was almost over, and he began to wonder what would happen once the orb had been restored to the hall of the Revan King. There would no longer be any reason for his companions to remain together. Barak would return to Val Alorn. Silk would certainly find some other part of the world more interesting. Hatar and Mandaralan and Relg would return home, and even Sinedra, once she had gone through the ceremony of presenting herself in the throne room, would be called back to Tol Honeth. The adventure was almost over, and they would all pick up their lives again. Right? They would promise to get together someday and probably be quite sincere about it. But Garion knew that once they parted, he would never see them all together again. He wondered also about his own life. The visit to Faldor's farm had forever closed that door to him, even if it had ever really been open. The bits and pieces of information he had been gathering for the past year and more told him quite plainly that he was not going to be in a position to make his own decisions for quite some time. This line here is in italics. I don't suppose you'd consider telling me what I'm supposed to do next. He didn't really expect any kind of satisfactory answer from that other awareness. It's a bit premature, the dry voice in his mind replied. We'll be in Riva tomorrow, Garion pointed out. As soon as we put the orb back where it belongs, this part of the adventure will be all finished. Don't you think that a hint or two might be in order along about now? I wouldn't want to spoil anything for you. You know, sometimes I think you keep secrets just because you know that it irritates people. What an interesting idea. The conversation got absolutely nowhere after that. It was about noon on the day before Aristide when Greldic's ice-coated ship tacked heavily into the sheltered harbor of the city of Riva on the east coast of the Isle of the Winds. A jutting promontory of wind-lashed rock protected the harbor, basin, and the city itself. Riva, Garion saw immediately, was a fortress. The wharves were backed by a high, thick city wall, and the narrow, snow-choked gravel strand stretching out to either side of the wharves was also cut off from access to the city. A cluster of makeshift buildings and low, varicolored tents stood on the strand, huddled against the city wall and half buried in snow. Garion thought he recognized Tolnedrans and a few Drasnian merchants moving quickly through the little enclave in the raw wind. The city itself rose sharply up the steep slope upon which it was built, each succeeding row of gray stone houses towering over the ones below. The windows facing out toward the harbor were all very narrow and very high up in the buildings, and Garion could see the tactical advantage of such construction. The terraced city was a series of successive barriers. Breaching the gates would accomplish virtually nothing. Each terrace would be as impregnable as the main wall. Surmounting the entire city, and brooding down at it, rose the final fortress, its towers and battlements as gray as everything else in the bleak city of the Rivans. The blue and white sword banners of Riva stood out stiffly in the wind above the fortress, outlined sharply against the dark gray clouds scudding across the winter sky. King Anheg of Cherek, clad in fur, and Brand, the Rivan warder, wearing his gray cloak, stood on the wharf before the city gates, waiting for them as Greldic's sailors rowed the ship smartly up to the wharf. Beside them, his reddish gold hair spread smoothly out over his green-cloaked shoulders, stood Leldorin of Wildantor. Surprise! The young Asturian was grinning broadly. Garion took one incredulous look at his friend. Then, with a shout of joy, as I almost pull my phone off the desk, with a shout of joy, he jumped to the top of the rail and leaped across to the stone wharf. He and Leldorin caught each other in a rough bear hug, laughing and pounding each other on the shoulders with their fists. "Are you all right?" Garion demanded. "I mean, did you completely recover and everything?" It's been so long since Leldorin's been here that I do not remember his voice in the slightest. He wasn't ever in very much, was he? "I'm as sound as ever," Leldorin assured him with a laugh. Garion looked at his friend's face dubiously. "You'd say that even if you were bleeding to death, Leldorin." "No, I'm really fine," the Asturian protested. "The young sister of Baron Oltorain leached the Algroth poison from my veins with poultices and vile-tasting potions, and restored me to health with her art. She's a marvelous girl." His eyes glowed as he spoke of her. "What are you doing here in Riva?" Garion demanded. "Lady Polgara's message reached me last week," Leldorin explained. "I was still at Baron Oltorain's castle." He coughed a bit uncomfortably. "For one reason or another, I had kept putting off my departure. Anyway, when her instruction to travel to Riva with all possible haste reached me, I left at once. Surely you knew about the message." "This is the first I've heard of it," Garion replied, looking over to where Aunt Pol, followed by Queen Silar and Queen Layla, was stepping down from the ship to the wharf. "Where's Rodar?" Chohag was asking King Anheg.
"He stayed up at the citadel,"
Anheg shrugged.
"There isn't really that much point to his hauling that paunch of his up and down the steps to the harbor any more than he has to."
"How is he?" King Fulrak asked.
"I think he's lost some weight,"
Anheg replied.
"The approach of fatherhood seems to have had some impact on his appetite."
"When's the child due?" Queen Layla asked curiously.
"I really couldn't say, Layla," the King of Cherik told her. "I have trouble keeping track of things like that. Purin had to stay at Bakhtor, though. I guess she's too far along to travel. Islena's here, though."
"I need to talk with you, Garion," Leldorin said nervously. "Of course." Garion led his friend several yards down the snowy pier away from the turmoil of disembarking. "I'm afraid that the Lady Pulgara's going to be cross with me, Garion," Leldorin said quietly. "Why cross?" Garion said it suspiciously. "Well," Leldorin hesitated, "a few things went wrong along the way. Sort of." "What exactly are we talking about when we say, 'went wrong, sort of'?" "I was at Baron Olterain's castle," Leldorin began. "I got that part." Oh, there's no puppy here. I was expecting a puppy behind me to give a snack to. Yes. Ariana, the Lady Ariana, that is, Baron Olterain's sister, the blonde Mimbrate girl who nursed you back to health. You remember her! Leldorin sounded very pleased about that. "Do you remember how lovely she is? How—" "I think we're getting away from the point, Leldorin," Garion said firmly. "We were talking about why Aunt Pole's going to be cross with you." "I'm getting to it, Garion." "Well, to put it briefly, Ariana and I had become, well, friends." "I see." "Nothing improper, you understand," Leldorin said quickly. "But our friendship was such that, well, we didn't want to be separated." The young Asturian's face appealed to his friend for understanding. "Actually," he went on, "it was a bit more than didn't want to. Ariana told me that she'd die if I left her behind." "Possibly she was exaggerating?" Garion suggested. "How could I risk it, though?" Leldorin protested. "Women are much more delicate than we are. Besides, Ariana's a physician. She'd know if she'd die, wouldn't she?" "I'm sure she would," Garion sighed. "Why don't you just plunge on with the story, Leldorin? I think I'm ready for the worst now." "It's not that I really meant any harm," Leldorin said plaintively. "Of course not. Anyway, Ariana and I left the castle very late one evening. I knew the knight on guard at the drawbridge, so I hit him over the head because I didn't want to hurt him." Garion blinked. "I knew that he'd be honor-bound to try to stop us," Leldorin explained. "I didn't want to have to kill him, so I hit him over the head." "I suppose that makes sense," Garion said dubiously. "Ariana's almost positive that he won't die." "Die?" "I hit him just a little too hard, I think." "So I probably didn't kill him. The others had all disembarked and were preparing to follow Brand and King Anheg up the steep, snow-covered stairs toward the upper levels of the city. "So that's why you think Aunt Pole might be cross with you," Garion said as he and Leldoran fell in at the rear of the group. "Well, that's not exactly the whole story, Garion," Leldoran admitted. "A few other things happened, too." "Such as what?" "Well, they chased us a little, and I had to kill a few of their horses." "I see." "I specifically aimed my arrows at the horses and not at the men. It wasn't my fault that Baron Oltorain couldn't get his foot clear of the stirrup, was it?" "How badly was he hurt?" Garion was almost resigned by now. "Nothing serious at all. At least, I don't think so. A broken leg, perhaps. The one he broke before when Sir Manderallan unhorsed him." "Go on," Garion told him. "The priest did have it coming, though," Leldoran declared hotly. "What priest?" "The priest of Chaldan at the little chapel, who wouldn't marry us because Ariana couldn't give him a document proving that she had her family's consent. He was very insulting." "Did you break anything?" "A few of his teeth is about all. And I stopped hitting him as soon as he agreed to perform the ceremony." "And so you're married? Congratulations. I'm sure you'll both be very happy, just as soon as they let you out of prison." Leldoran drew himself up. "It's a marriage in name only, Garion. I would never take advantage of it. You know me better than that. We reasoned that Ariana's reputation might suffer if it became known that we were traveling alone like that. The marriage was just for the sake of appearances." Sharker Spear. I didn't even notice Sharker Spear. Wow, this is yeah. This is quite the comedy of errors that he's unfolding. I stopped hitting him as soon as he agreed to perform the ceremony. Oh, look at that guy. Come get it. Wow. As Leldoran described his disastrous journey through Erendia, Garion glanced curiously at the city of Riva. There was a kind of unrelieved bleakness about its snow-covered streets. The buildings were all very tall and were of a uniform gray color. The few evergreen bows, wreaths, and brightly hued buntings hung in celebration of the Aristide season seemed somehow to accentuate the stiff grimness of the city. There were, however, some very interesting smells coming from kitchens where Aristide feasts simmered and roasted under the watchful eyes of the women of Riva. "That was all of it, then?" Garion asked his friend. "You stole Baron Oltorain's sister, married her without his consent, broke his leg and assaulted several of his people, and a priest. That was everything that happened?" "Well, not exactly." Leldoran's face was a bit pained. "There's more?" "I didn't really mean to hurt Torreson." "Your cousin?" Leldoran nodded moodily. "Ariana and I took refuge at my Uncle Reldigan's house, And Torreson made some remarks about Ariana. She is a membrate, after all, and Torreson's very prejudiced. My remonstrances were quite temperate, I thought, all things considered. But after I knocked him down the stairs, nothing would satisfy him but a duel. You killed him? Garion asked in a shocked voice. Of course I didn't kill him. All I did was run him through the leg. Just a little bit. How can you run somebody through just a little bit, Leldorin? Garion demanded of his friend in exasperation. You're disappointed in me, aren't you, Garion? The young Asturian seemed almost on the verge of tears. Garion rolled his eyes skyward and gave up. Oh, the mic's gonna bark, so I'm just gonna mute for a moment. Okay, volume's back. Sorry about that. So, we definitely had a head injury, even if it was an unnamed character. I don't know if we want to wait for a named character to get a head injury, though, because in the eyes of the law, it may be considered... Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly certain that, like Garion said, you stole his sister. I think, according to the Baron, it would be considered a kidnapping. But according to Leldorin, it is certainly not. So, and according to Ariana, who is the subject. So I'm not sure about that one necessarily. We definitely had a head injury, but it was just some random guard. So I don't know if we want to hold off on that for now. Oh boy, this whole scene though. Ran his cousin through the leg a little. Alright, so. You're disappointed in me, Garion, aren't you? Or, you're disappointed in me, aren't you, Garion? I don't know why I read that all jumbled. The young Asturian seemed almost on the verge of tears. Garion rolled his eyes skyward and gave up. No, Leldorin, I'm not disappointed. A little startled, perhaps, but not really disappointed. Was there anything else you can remember? Anything you might have left out? Lildorn may be leaving out some head injuries. I'm going to finish this scene anyways. Well, I hear that I've sort of been declared an outlaw in Arendia. Sort of. The Crown's put a price on my head, Lildorn admitted. Or so I understand. Garion began to laugh, helplessly. A true friend wouldn't laugh at my misfortunes, the young man complained, looking injured. You managed to get into that much trouble in just a week. None of it was really my fault, Garion. Things just got out of hand, that's all. Do you think Lady Polgara's going to be angry? I'll talk to her, Garion assured his impulsive young friend. Maybe if she and Mandaralin appeal to King Corodulin, they can get him to take the price off your head. Is it true that you and Sir Mandaralin destroyed the Murgo Nachak and all his henchmen in the throne room at Vomimbre? Lildorn asked suddenly. I think the story might have gotten a bit garbled, Garion replied. I denounced Nachak, and Mandaralin offered to fight him to prove that what I said was true. Nachak's men attacked Mandaralin then, and Barak and Hetar joined in. Hetar's the one who actually killed Nachak. We did manage to keep your name, and Torison's, out of it. You're a true friend, Garion. All right, that's the end of that bit. I think it's fair that, we had a head injury specifically talked about that possibly didn't kill someone, so I think it's worth putting a dot on for that. If nothing other than to just for all that whole scene, just for the value of that scene. Head injury. I went less overboard that time. Okay, puppy. There you go. Collecting his toll. Oh boy, that was a lot. And we're not even done the chapter.
Here?
Barak was saying.
What's she doing here? She came with Eslena and me,
King Anheg replied.
Did she?
Anheg nodded.
Your son's with her, and your daughter's. His birth seems to have mellowed her a bit. What does he look like?
Barak asked eagerly.
He's a great red-headed brute of a boy.
Anheg laughed.
And when he gets hungry, you can hear him yell for a mile.
Barak grinned rather foolishly. When they reached the top of the stairs and came out in the shallow square before the great hall, two rosy-cheeked little girls in green cloaks were waiting impatiently for them. They both had long, reddish-blonde braids and seemed to be only slightly older than Erend. Oh, that's what you're talking about. I see. I was thinking it's even got a little bit of a fuse. I was thinking it almost looks like a cartoony bomb. Like there's a little spark coming off of it. Papa! The youngest of the two squealed, running to Barak. The huge man caught her up in his arms and kissed her soundly. The second girl, a year or so older than her sister, joined them with a show of dignity, but was also swept up in her father's embrace.
"My daughters!"
Barak introduced the girls to the rest of the party.
"This is Gundred."
He poked his great red beard into the face of the eldest girl, and she giggled as his whiskers tickled her face.
"And this is little Tersey."
He smiled fondly at the youngest. "We have a little brother, Papa," the elder girl informed him gravely.
"What an amazing thing!"
Barak replied, feigning a great show of astonishment. "You knew about it already," Gundred accused him. "We wanted to be the ones to tell you." She pouted. "His name's Unrak, and he's got red hair, just the same as you have," Tersey announced. "But he doesn't have a beard yet."
"I expect that will come in time,"
Barak assured her. "He yells a lot," Gundred reported, "and he hasn't got any teeth." Then the broad gateway to the Rivan citadel swung open, and Queen Islena, wearing a dark red cloak, emerged from within, accompanied by a lovely blonde Erendish girl, and by Merrill, Barak's wife. Merrill was dressed all in green, and she was carrying a blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms. Her expression was one of pride. "Hail Barak, Earl of Trelheim and husband," she said with great formality. "Thus have I fulfilled my ultimate duty." She extended the bundle. "Behold your son Unrak, Trelheim's heir." With a strange expression, Barak gently set his daughters down, approached his wife, and took the bundle from her. Very gently, his great fingers trembling, he turned back the blanket to gaze for the first time at his son's face. Garion could see only that the baby had bright red hair, much the same color as Barak's.
"Hail, Unrak, heir to Trelheim and my son!"
Barak greeted the infant in his rumbling voice. Then he kissed the child in his hands. The baby boy giggled and cooed as his father's great beard tickled his face. His two tiny hands reached up and clutched at the beard, and he burrowed his face into it like a puppy.
"He's got a good, strong grip,"
Barak commented to his wife, wincing as the infant tugged at his beard. Merrill's eyes seemed almost startled, and her expression was unreadable.
"This is my son, Unrak,"
Barak announced to the rest of them, holding the baby up so that they could see him.
"It may be a bit early to tell, but he shows some promise."
Barak's wife had drawn herself up with pride. "I have done well, then, my lord?"
"Beyond all my expectations, Merrill,"
he told her. Then, holding the baby in one arm, he caught her in the other and kissed her exuberantly. She seemed even more startled than before.
"Let's go inside,"
the brutish-looking King Anheg suggested.
"It's very cold out here, and I'm a sentimental man. I'd rather not have tears freezing in my beard."
The Erendish girl joined Leldorin and Garion as they entered the fortress. "And this is my Ariana," Leldorin told Garion, with an expression of total adoration on his face. For a moment, for just a moment, Garion had some hope for his impossible friend. Lady Ariana was a slim, practical-looking Mimbrate girl, whose medical studies had given her face a certain seriousness. The look she directed at Leldorin, however, immediately dispelled any hope. Garion shuddered inwardly at the total lack of anything resembling reason in the gaze these two exchanged. Ariana would not restrain Leldorin as he crashed headlong into disaster after disaster. She would encourage him. She would cheer him on. "My lord hath awaited thy coming most eagerly," she said to Garion as they followed the others along a broad stone corridor. The very slight stress she put on "my lord" indicated that while Leldorin might think that their marriage was one in name only, she did not. "We're very good friends," Garion told her. He looked around, a bit embarrassed by the way these two kept staring into each other's eyes. Almost another spot. "Is this the hall of the Raven King, then?" he asked. "'Tis generally called so," Ariana replied. "The ravens themselves speak with more precision, however. Lord Olban, youngest son of the Raven Warder, hath most graciously shown us throughout the fortress, and he doth speak of this as the citadel. The hall of the Raven King is the throne room itself." "Ah," Garion said. "I see." He looked away quickly, not wanting to see the way all thought vanished from her eyes when they returned to their contemplation of Leldorin's face. I don't know. It's close, I think. It's real close. What do the Sharkies and Farmhouse think? He's certainly uncomfortable. But he's not stuck. Awkwardness intensifies. King Rodar of Drasnia, wearing his customary red robe, was sitting in the large, low-beamed dining room where a fire crackled in a cave-like fireplace and a multitude of candles gave off a warm, golden light. Rodar vastly filled a chair at the head of a long table with the ruins of his lunch spread before him. So rude. His crown was hung negligently on the back of his chair, and his round, red face was gleaming with perspiration.
"Finally!"
No.
"Finally!"
No.
"Finally!"
he said with a grunt. He waddled ponderously to greet them. He fondly embraced Polgara, kissed Queen Silar and Queen Layla, and took the hands of King Chohag and King Fulrak in his own.
"It's been a long time,"
he said to them. I've changed it definitely since last time. Then he turned to Belgrath.
"What took you so long?"
he asked.
"We had a long way to go, Rodar,"
the old sorcerer replied, pulling off his cloak and backing up to the broad-arched fireplace.
"You don't go from here to Rakthol in a week, you know. I hear that you and Tuchik finally had it out,"
the king said. Silk laughed sardonically. "It was a splendid little get-together, uncle."
"I'm sorry I missed it."
King Rodar looked inquiringly at Sinedra and Adara, his expression openly admiring.
"Ladies,"
he said, to them, bowing politely,
"if someone will introduce us, I'll be more than happy to bestow a few royal kisses."
Rodar's being gross.
"If Poren catches you kissing pretty girls, she'll carve out your tripes, Rodar."
King Anheg laughed crudely. As Aunt Pole made the introductions, Garion drew back a few paces to consider the havoc Leldorin had caused in one short week. Right? Was that another sardonically? It was. Yep. That's so far in this part of the book. Every single time he's spoken, it's been sardonically. It was going to take months to unravel it, and there was no guarantee that it would not happen again. Indeed, that it would not happen every time the young man got loose. "What's the matter with your friend?" It was the Princess Sinedra, and she was tugging on Garion's sleeve. "What do you mean, what's the matter with him?" "You mean he's always like that?" Leldorin... Garion hesitated. "Well, Leldorin's very enthusiastic about things. And sometimes he speaks or acts without stopping to think." Loyalty made him want to put the best face on it. "Garion," Sinedra's gaze was very direct, "I know errands, and he's the most errandish errand I've ever met. He's so errandish that he's almost incapacitated." Wow. Garion quickly came to the defense of his friend. "He's not that bad." "Really? And Lady Ariana, she's a lovely girl, a skilled physician, and utterly devoid of anything remotely resembling thought." "They're in love," Garion said, as if that explained everything. "What's that got to do with it?" "Love does things to people," Garion told her. "It seems to knock holes in their judgment or something." "What a fascinating observation," Sinedra replied. "Do go on." Garion was too preoccupied with the problem to catch the dangerous lilt in her voice. "As soon as somebody falls in love, all the wits seem to dribble out of the bottom of his head," he continued moodily. "What a colorful way to put it," Sinedra said. Garion even missed that warning. "It's almost as if it were some kind of disease," he added. "Do you know something, Garion?" the princess said in a conversational, almost casual tone of voice. "Sometimes you make me positively sick." And she turned and walked away, leaving him staring after her in open-mouthed astonishment. "What did I say?" he called after her, but she ignored him. After they had all dined, King Rodar turned to Belgarath. "Do you suppose we might have a look at the orb?" he asked.
"Tomorrow," the old man answered. "We'll reveal it when it's returned to its proper place in the hall of the Revan King at midday." "We've all seen it before, Belgarath,"
King Anheg asserted.
"What's the harm in our having a look now?"
Belgarath shook his head stubbornly.
"There are reasons, Anheg," he said. "I think it may surprise you tomorrow, and I wouldn't want to spoil it for anyone."
"Stop him, Dernick," Polgara said, as Erend slipped from his seat and walked around the table toward King Rodar, his hand fumbling with the strings of the pouch at his waist. "Oh no, little fellow," Dernick said, catching the boy from behind and lifting him up into his arms. "What a beautiful child," Queen Islena observed. "Who is he?"
"That's our thief,"
Belgarath replied.
"Zedar found him someplace and raised him as a total innocent. At the moment, he seems to be the only one in the world who can touch the orb." "Is it in that pouch?"
Anheg asked. Belgarath nodded.
He's caused us all some anxiety along the way. He keeps trying to give it to people. If he decides to offer you something, I don't really advise taking it." "I wouldn't dream of it,"
Anheg agreed. As was usually the case, once Aaron's attention had been diverted, he immediately seemed to forget about the orb. His gaze focused on the infant Barak was holding. As soon as Dernick set him down, he went over to look at the baby. Unrak returned the look, and some peculiar recognition seemed to pass between them. Then Aaron gently kissed the child in Barak's arms, and Unrak, smiling, took hold of the strange little boy's finger. Gundred and Terzi gathered close, and Barak's great face rose from the garden of children clustered about him. Garion could clearly see the tears glistening in his friend's eyes as he looked at his wife, Merrill. The look she returned to him was strangely tender. For the first time Garion could remember, she smiled at her husband. That's the end of chapter 10. It's not quite 8 o'clock yet, so should I keep on going straight into chapter 11? I think I probably should. Almost done with these, Ben. You can start eating. You don't have to wait for me to eat. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It's too noisy. Okay. I think we should go through one more chapter. It's been a while since we've done 2. And we're not even at an hour yet. Okay, stop me if you need to. I'm going for it. Agreed. Chapter 11. That night, a sudden, savage storm howled down from the northwest to claw at the unyielding rock of the Isle of the Winds. Great waves crashed and thundered against the cliffs, and a shrieking gale howled among the ancient battlements of Iron Grip's citadel. The firm-set rock of the fortress seemed almost to shudder as the seething storm lashed again and again at the walls. Garion slept fitfully. There was not only the shriek and bellow of wind and the rattle of sleet, twice in one part, against close shuttered windows to contend with, nor the gusting draughts that blew suddenly down every corridor to set unlatched doors banging. But there were also those peculiar moments of oppressive silence that were almost as bad as the noise. Strange dreams stalked his sleep that night. Some great, momentous, and unexplained event was about to take place, and there were all manner of peculiar things that he had to do in preparation for it. He did not know why he had to do them, and no one would tell him if he were doing them right or not. There seemed to be some kind of dreadful hurry, and people kept rushing him from one thing to the next, without ever giving him time to make sure that anything was really finished. Even the storm seemed to be mixed up in it, like some howling enemy trying with noise and wind and crashing waves to break the absolute concentration necessary to complete each task. "Are you ready?" It was Aunt Pole, and she was placing a long-handled kitchen kettle on his head like a helmet and handing him a pot-lid shield and a wooden stick sword. "What am I supposed to do?" he demanded of her. "You know," she replied. "Hurry. It's getting late." "No, Aunt Pole, I don't. Really." "Of course you do. Now, stop wasting time." He looked around, feeling very confused and apprehensive. Not far away, Runderig stood with that same rather foolish look on his face that had always been there. Runderig also had a kettle on his head, a pot-lid shield, and a wooden sword. Apparently he and Runderig were supposed to do this together. Garion smiled at his friend, and Runderig grinned back. "That's right," Aunt Pole said encouragingly. "Now kill him. Hurry, Garion. You have to be finished by supper time." He spun around to stare at her. Kill Runderig? But when he looked back, it was not Runderig. Instead, the face that looked at him from beneath the kettle was maimed and hideous.
"No, no,"
Barak said impatiently.
"Don't hold it like that. Grip it in both hands and keep it pointed at his chest. Keep the point low so that when he charges, he doesn't knock the spear aside with his tusks. Now do it again. Try to get it right this time. Hurry, Garion. We don't have all day, you know."
The big man nudged the dead boar with his foot, and the boar got up and began to paw at the snow. Barak gave Garion a quick look.
"Are you ready?"
he demanded. Then he was standing on a strange, colorless plain, and there seemed to be statues all around him. No, not statues, figures. King Anheg was there, or a figure that looked just like him, and King Corodulin, and Queen Islena, and there was the Earl of Yarvik, and over there was Nachak, the Murgo ambassador at Vomimbre. "Which piece do you want to move?" It was the dry voice in his mind. "I don't know the rules," Garion objected. "That doesn't matter. You have to move. It's your turn." When Garion turned back, one of the figures was rushing at him. It wore a cowled robe, and its eyes bulged with madness. Without thinking, Garion raised his hand to ward off the figure's attack. "Is that the move you want to make?" the voice asked him. "I don't know." "It's too late to change it now. You've already touched him. From now on, you have to make your own moves." "Is that one of the rules?" "That's the way it is. Are you ready?" There was the smell of loam and of ancient oak trees.
"You really must learn to control your tongue, Polgara,"
Asherak the Murgo said with a bland smile, slapping Aunt Pole sharply across the face. "It's your move again," the dry voice said. "There's only one that you can make." "Do I have to do it? Isn't there anything else I can do?" "It's the only move there is. You'd better hurry." With a deep sigh of regret, Garion reached out and set fire to Asherak with the palm of his hand. A sudden, gusting draught banged open the door of the room Garion shared with Leldorin, and the two of them sat bolt upright in their beds. "I'll latch it again," Leldorin said, throwing back the covers and stumbling across the chilly stones of the floor. "How long's it going to keep blowing like this?" Garion asked peevishly. "How's anyone supposed to sleep with all this noise?" Leldorin closed the door again, and Garion heard him fumbling around in the darkness. There was a scraping click and a sudden bright spark. The spark went out, and Leldorin tried again. This time it caught in the tinder. The young Asturian blew on it, and it grew brighter, then flared into a small finger of flame. "Have you got any idea what time it is?" Garion asked as his friend lighted the candle. "Some hours before dawn, I imagine," Leldorin replied. Garion groaned. "It feels like this night's already been about 10 years long." "We can talk for a while," Leldorin suggested. "Maybe the storm will die down toward dawn." "Talking's better than lying here in the dark, jumping at every sound," Garion agreed, sitting up and pulling his blanket around his shoulders. "Things have happened to you since we saw each other last, haven't they, Garion?" Leldorin asked, climbing back into his own bed. "A lot of things," Garion told him. "Not all of them good, either." "You've changed a great deal," Leldorin noted. "I've been changed. There's a difference. Most of it wasn't my idea. You've changed too, you know." "Me?" Leldorin laughed ruefully. "I'm afraid not, my friend. The mess I've made of things in the past week is proof that I haven't changed at all." "That will take a bit of straightening out, won't it?" Garion agreed. "The funny part about it all is that there is a perverse sort of logic about the whole thing. There wasn't one single thing you did that was actually insane. It's just when you put them all together, it starts to look like a catastrophe." Leldorin sighed. "And now my poor Ariana and I are doomed to perpetual exile." "I think we'll be able to fix it," Garion assured him. "Your uncle will forgive you, and Torrison probably will too. He likes you too much to stay angry for long. Baron Ulterain is probably very put out with you, but he's a Mimbrate errand. He'll forgive anything if it's done for love. We might have to wait until his leg heals up again, though. That was the part that was a real blunder, Leldorin. You shouldn't have broken his leg." "Next time I'll try to avoid that," Leldorin promised quickly. "Next time?" They both laughed then, and talked on as their candle flickered in the vagrant draughts stirred by the raging storm. After an hour or so, the worst of the gale seemed to pass, and the two of them found their eyes growing heavy once more. "Why don't we try to sleep again?" Garion suggested. "I'll blow out the candle," Leldorin agreed. He got out of bed and stepped to the table. "Are you ready?" he asked Garion. Garion slept again almost immediately, and almost immediately heard a sibilant whisper in his ear and felt a dry, cold touch. "Are you ready?" the whispering voice hissed, and he turned to look with uncomprehending eyes at the face of Queen Salmisra, a face that shifted back and forth from woman to snake to something midway between. Then he stood beneath the shimmering dome of the Cave of the Gods, and moved without thought to touch the unblemished, walnut-colored shoulder of the stillborn colt, thrusting his hand into the absolute silence of death itself.
"Are you ready?"
Belgarath asked quite calmly. "I think so."
"All right. Put your will against it and push."
"It's awfully heavy, Grandfather."
"You don't have to pick it up, Garion. Just push it. It'll roll over if you do it right. Hurry up. We have a great deal more to do."
Garion began to gather his will. And then he sat on a hillside with his cousin Adara. In his hand he held a dead twig and a few wisps of dry grass. "Are you ready?" the voice in his mind asked him. "Is this going to mean anything?" Garion asked. "I mean, will it make any difference?" "That depends on how well you do it." "That's not a very good answer." "It wasn't a very good question." "If you're ready, turn the twig into a flower." Garion did that, and looked critically at the result. "It's not a very good flower, is it?" he apologized. "It'll have to do," the voice told him. "Let me try it again." "What are you going to do with this one?" "I'll just—" Garion raised his hand to obliterate the defective bloom he had just created. "That's forbidden, you know," the voice reminded him. "I made it, didn't I?" "That has nothing to do with it. You can't unmake it. It'll be fine. Come along now. We have to hurry." "I'm not ready yet." "That's too bad. We can't wait any longer." And then Garion woke up. He felt oddly light-headed, as if his troubled sleep had done him more harm than good. Leldorin was still deep in slumber, and Garion found his clothes in the dark, pulled them on, and quietly left the room. The strange dream nagged at his mind as he wandered in the dimly lighted corridors of Iron Grip's citadel. He still felt that pressing urgency and the peculiar sense that everyone was waiting impatiently for him to do something. He found a wind-swept courtyard where snow had piled up in the corners and the stones were black and shiny with ice. Dawn was just breaking, and the battlements surrounding the courtyard were etched sharply against a sky filled with scudding cloud. Beyond the courtyard lay the stables, warm, smelling of fragrant hay and of horses. Dernick had already found his way there. As was so frequently the case, the smith was uncomfortable in the presence of nobility, and he sought the company of animals instead. "Couldn't you sleep either?" he asked as Garion entered the stable. Garion shrugged. For some reason, sleep just made things worse. I feel as if my head's stuffed full of straw. "Joyous Aristide, Garion," Dernick said then. "That's right. It is, isn't it?" In all the rush, the holiday seemed to have crept up on him. Joyous Aristide, Dernick. The colt, who had been sleeping in a back stall, nickered softly as he caught Garion's scent, and Garion and Dernick went back to where the small animal stood. "Joyous Aristide, horse," Garion greeted him a bit whimsically. The colt nuzzled at him. "Do you think that the storm's blown over completely?" Garion asked Dernick as he rubbed the colt's ears. "Or is there more on the way?" "It has the smell of being over," Dernick answered. "Weather could smell differently here on this island, though." Garion nodded his agreement, patted the colt's neck, and turned toward the door. "I suppose I'd better go find Aunt Pole," he said. "She was saying something last night about wanting to check my clothes. If I make her look for me, she'll probably make me wish I hadn't." "Age is bringing you wisdom, I see." Dernick grinned at him. "If anyone wants me, I'll be here." Garion put his hand briefly on Dernick's shoulder, and then left the stable to go looking for Aunt Pole. He found her in the company of women in the apartment that appeared to have been set aside for her personal use centuries before. Adara was there, and Taiba, Queen Layla, and Ariana, the Membrate girl. In the center of the room stood Princess Senedra. "You're up early," Aunt Pole observed, her needle flickering as she made some minute modification to Senedra's creamy gown. "I had trouble sleeping," he told her, looking at the princess with a certain puzzlement. She looked different somehow. "Don't stare at me, Garion," she told him rather primly. "What have you done to your hair?" he asked her. Senedra's flaming hair had been elaborately arranged, caught at brow and temples by a gold coronet in the form of a band of twined oak leaves. There was some rather intricate braiding involved at the back, and then the coppery mass flowed smoothly down over one of her tiny shoulders. "Do you like it?" she asked him. "That's not the way you usually wear it," he noted. "We're all aware of that, Garion," she replied loftily. Then she turned and looked rather critically at her reflection in the mirror. "I'm still not convinced about the braiding, Lady Polgara," she fretted. "Tonadran ladies don't braid their hair. This makes me look like an Alorn." "Not entirely, Senedra," Adara murmured. "You know what I mean, Adara. All those buxom blondes with their braids and their milkmaid complexions." "Isn't it a little early to be getting ready?" Garion asked. "Grandfather said that we weren't going to take the orb to the throne room until noon." "That's not really that far off, Garion," Aunt Pole told him, biting a thread and stepping back to look critically at Senedra's dress. "What do you think, Layla?" "She looks just like a princess, Pole," Queen Layla gushed. "She is a princess, Layla," Aunt Pole reminded the plump little queen. Then she turned to Garion. "Get some breakfast and have someone show you the way to the baths. she instructed. "They're in the cellars under the west wing. After you've bathed, you will need a shave. Try not to cut yourself. I don't want you bleeding all over your good clothes." "Do I have to wear all that?" She gave him a look that immediately answered that question, as well as several others he might have asked. "I'll go find Silk," he agreed quickly. "He'll know where the baths are." "Do that," she told him quite firmly, "and don't get lost. When the time comes, I want you to be ready." Garion nodded and left. Her words had somehow strangely echoed the words of his dream, and he wondered about that as he went looking for Silk. I'm just going to check how many pages are left, because I think I'm going to stop here, because I'm getting a little lightheaded. I haven't eaten very much today, dumbly. So if nobody minds, I think I'm going to stop there for tonight and go eat some food, because I'm finding I'm just a little Sorry to disappoint, but we'll finish this chapter and read the next one on Wednesday. If everyone's okay. Alright. So yeah, Wednesdays should be fine, so I'll be back here on the 11th of January. Look at that pup. Alright. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks for joining. Look forward to next Wednesday. See you then. Bye.